that is last week and possibly the week before, and had wanted to hear from some other folks who've been interested following this conversation, very much part of the discussions that have been going on all summer and all fall, to try and come to a place that everybody can be comfortable with. And we're going to start out by hearing first today from the conservation districts and the Sustainable Jobs Fund, and then the Land Access and Opportunity Board. So with that, welcome.
Thank you. For the record, I'm Michelle Monroe. I'm the Executive Director of the Vermont Association of Conservation Districts. I just want to start my testimony by saying that the districts do not have a formal position on this issue yet, because the conversations have been so in flux that I have not brought it to them to get a consensus position. So I'm really just speaking about some general principles and observations from having been involved in these conversations that you referenced, Chair Durfee, over the last few months. So I think one thing that you are probably hearing loud and clear from many groups that work with farms is that we would rather not change the definition of farming in the RAPs as part of sort of resolving this question around municipal authority over farms. I think that really seems to be a separate issue. How do we define a farm for the purposes of being regulated under the RAPs is different from what authority should municipalities have and where should they have it to oversee farms. I think those are really two. Because of the history of how the RAPs have been used, they're sort of interconnected. They've become interconnected. But I think this is an opportunity to really kind of separate those a bit. Because if you're representing farms, you're going to advocate, and farms are going to determine the extent of municipal regulation is going to be determined in the RAPs. You're going to want to maximize how many farms fall under those RAPs. But that might not actually be appropriate for the purposes of really, truly follow, the regulation of the RAPs, the provided regulation, if that makes sense. I think it does. And so, one of the things that the driving issue behind this has been.
Actually, sorry, I'm going to stop you there.
Yeah.
And go back to if that makes sense, because I think this is really
okay.
Sort of the critical thing. Since we did hear testimony from the agency representing the interests or this. Yep. One understanding of the interests of farmers on this question, and they are recommending reopening. So can you just let's spend another few minutes talking about what that might mean?
I think so. If you're farming, if you're a small backyard operation, I was talking with one of your colleagues last week who raises backyard chickens and donates the eggs to his local food bank, and under some versions of the RAPs that have been kicked around this past summer, that if he's donating $2,000 or $1,000 worth of eggs, that could qualify him to be regulated under the RAPs. And is that really appropriate? An appropriate level of regulation for somebody who's raising backyard chickens and donating eggs? And so I think there's an interest in, if the definition of farming in the RAPs has that municipal exemption, then advocates for farming may want to say, let's maximize the number of people who are exempted from municipal regulation by maximizing the number of people who fall under the RAPs. But is that truly what would be in the interest of the state, or in the interest of those farmers who would then fall, or people who might just be backyard homesteaders who might now fall under the RAPs because they sell or donate some of the stuff that they raise on their home, on their backyard homestead? So I think it really is, would be clearer, and from a policy perspective, a better approach to look at the approach that VLCT has suggested. I think is an interesting one of saying it's not about what you're doing or how many agricultural activities you're engaged in. It's about where you're engaging in them. I think that might be a different approach that would provide some clarity around authority without having to get into all of these questions about who falls under the required agricultural practices and who has to comply with them. Instead, it would be, if you're in Rutland City, what authority will the municipality have over you if you're located in one of these dense, small areas. And, you know, we're not necessarily saying that, I don't think anyone is there yet on like tier 1B or tier 1A. Those are still conversations that we're having. As I mentioned, we were, all of us who are here now, we're talking with the LCT just downstairs ahead of this hearing. But that's, I think that would be the reason for looking at separating them and looking at a different way of approaching this.
Thank you for that. Representative Nelson.
Thank you, Chair. Tier 1A is its own animal. That's very high dense housing. Tier 1B is a different critter. And that's where I have a lot of concern with the VLTCs. Or VLCT. Is tier 1B, is there are many farms that could be roped into the tier 1B. We have the best soils. And that's where towns want to grow into, are those prime ag soils that are so dear and ought to be protected under almost all costs to feed people. And by putting the definition of farming in a tier, into the RAPs, I think it protects farmers. I don't think it's a hindrance for farmers. And as one that's working on the CAPO stakeholder group, no farmer has a right to pollute. And we have to assure that right to the public that we're not polluting. And if you have enough chickens to hit the $2,000, sell enough eggs for the $2,000 threshold, you have a fairly robust chicken farm. And you need to show how you handle your nutrients that farm produces. I don't understand your concerns with putting farming into the definition of the RAPs to give every farmer, every person the ability that meets that definition to grow food.
Oh, I think the ability to grow food is a separate question from, do you have to comply with this very specific set of regulations? And I think that those are separate things. I think, first, I share your concerns about 1B. I think everybody who's been involved in these conversations, aside from even VLCT, they're open to conversation around 1B, and is 1B really appropriate for allowing municipal regulation of farming activities?
I think what we heard and saw in their presentation last week was 1A specifically.
They talked a lot about 1A. They sort of slid 1B in there, but I think they've indicated in conversations we've had that they're not 100% sold on 1B either. There's area for discussion there. So I think, the proposal that you heard from Maddie Kempner on Thursday, that the ag groups would put forward, would have a right to grow food in it. And so the ag groups have spent a lot of time over the past few months talking about that right to grow food and what would that look like. The LCT has told us that they are interested in proposing a right to grow food. They think it should be located somewhere else in the regulations and not in Title 24. So I think that's one of the areas where we have broad agreement. And so Representative Nelson, I think there are ways we can ensure that all Vermonters have the ability to raise food, to feed themselves or to feed their neighbors if that's what they wish to do, without saying, do you fall under the required agricultural practices? Because I think once you start opening up the RAPs as part of this discussion, then there are other groups that have a stake in the RAPs, like the water quality groups, So I think it's just cleaner to me to say, we're going to talk about where is it appropriate and where is it not appropriate for towns to have authority over agricultural activities. And I think in the vast majority of the state of Vermont, it is not appropriate for towns to have authority over agricultural practices. And that seems to me like a good way to go, to say, sorry towns, you don't get to regulate farms, the vast majority of you, outside of these very dense areas where there is potential for conflict. That seems to me a good place to start the conversation. But then the question becomes, what authority should towns have and where should they have it? And that's the question that I think is still sort of lurking out there. How extensive should that authority be, and how extensive should the landmass that they have it be? Go back to the sort of the right to grow food, I think if that's an approach that the legislature takes, generally sort of any right that someone possesses, right? There's always an imposition against that right. Like no right is absolute. I can't yell fire in a burning theater, but the presumption is that any regulation of that right will be minimal. And I think that that's a good place to start, to say Vermonters have a right to grow food. And if and when there is regulation that impinges upon that right, it will be minimal to accomplish whatever the legitimate purpose is for impinging on that right. So that you're starting from a place of everybody gets to grow food. And that nobody can take that away from you. And should the state or a municipality be allowed to constrain that in any way, that constraint has to be minimal to accomplish whatever the stated purpose is of the constraint that they're imposing.
And my understanding, and you can correct me if I don't have this quite right, but is that the conversation around the right to grow food is the right to grow your own food, as opposed to raising food that you might sell or donate. That's also now been up, but that the court decision surrounds the business side of farming. That's what we're dealing with there, and we don't have currently anything in law that gives someone the right to grow food for their own purposes. So this would be we're dealing with the court decision, and at the same time you're saying, hey, we would like to have Vermonters be able to grow their own food, whether that's chickens, reasonable number of chickens, any vegetables. And
I think that's because the court decision directly impacts the right to grow food by giving municipalities the ability to regulate, or to some extent, I should say, increasing the ability of municipalities to regulate agricultural activities. So that means that now the town, I live in St. Albans City, the city doesn't let you raise roosters, but you can't have a cow. So there you go. So towns right now do have some of that ability, but it gives them, I think the concern is that it gives them more authority to impact and what people are able to do on their property around growing food, particularly because I think a lot of the conflict, while in this case the business was a business in Essex Junction, there were a lot of people who do some pretty intensive backyard homesteading that neighbors might object to, that could also lead to very similar kinds of conflicts. So it's not the issue from I think the perspective of the agricultural groups has not been limited to just, am I doing this for a living? Is this a business for me? But also.
So let's think about how do we clarify for Vermonters and for municipalities that you couldn't say, again, I'm going to use chickens just as an example, but a town wouldn't be able to say you cannot have chickens.
Town wouldn't be able to say that. They might be able to say, on a quarter-acre lot, you cannot have 4 dozen chickens. But they couldn't say you can't have any chickens. Similarly, I think the issue becomes with other forms of livestock as well. To say that you can't prohibit someone from raising a goat as long as they have a land base sufficient to support it.
Representative Byrd?
Yeah, along those lines, I think Steve Collier was giving testimony last week about, or maybe the week before. That's where, is it really, how are municipalities going to have the capacity to, make decisions about how many chickens are, sustainable on that land base? And I think that's where the mentality is coming from. Well, maybe this is actually something that still needs to fall under the jurisdiction of the agency.
And towns don't have that expertise, and they don't know what's needed. So I think that there is room to say, and really what we've gotten from the towns, what I took away from VLCT's testimony was that they were really concerned with things that municipalities regulate as a matter of course, like entrances and egresses from property, setbacks, that kind of thing, but less interested in saying you can't have this many birds on your property. I think that there would be that certainly the discussion that the agricultural groups has had is that we would like to see the agency retain that authority in terms of number and appropriateness of livestock on a given parcel. That should, because they're the people who have that experience and expertise. I'm just going to look to see if there was anything else that I really wanted to comment on, and then I can pass it off to other folks. We've talked about how everyone should have the right to grow food, and we've also, I think that this, as we're talking about that, though, that should be not just it should be an affirmative right in the sense that we are also starting to think about if we're going to put in these really dense multi-unit housing projects, where we're talking about 30, 40, 50 units, how do we ensure that the people in those units have access to a community garden, to a rooftop garden, to some place that they can, in fact, raise their own food, or raise a portion of their own food? And I think that is something that could potentially be included in whatever gets discussed here as maybe a little addition to Act 181, to say that this is something that Tier 1A planning needs to take into account, is how do we ensure that folks in these dense areas can grow food? And then I think the Land Access Opportunity Board is also up to testify, because I was going to recommend that you hear from them. So,
Okay. Good, thank you. Any other questions? Jean, if you're standing by and want to jump in next.
Hi, thank you. And Ornella,
We see you both now.
and thank you for inviting us in next. We're juggling a number of family matters today. And so unfortunately my timing is short, as I'm about to have to pick up my daughter, and really appreciate the committee letting us come in virtually today. We would have, of course, preferred to be with you in person. I'll just start with a quick introduction. I'm Jean Hamilton. I am the Director of Program Development for the Land Access and Opportunity Board. We operate as a co-directorship. Ornella, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, for the record, Ornella Mata Figueroa. I am Director of Community Engagement and Advocacy for the Land Access and Opportunity Board.
And yeah, we're planning to talk to you a little bit about our understanding of what happens when municipalities have the authority to regulate agriculture and what that means for the communities we serve. We will also give you a little bit of background on the LAOB and what brings us to this issue. And just so you have it in your minds as you're listening to our testimony, I want to share what we are recommending, which is that if towns are going to proceed, if Vermont is going to proceed in giving towns the authority to regulate our agriculture, we must ensure that there is accompanying policy that, one, makes a clear and actionable plan to inventory and protect community food land within any areas where there is municipal oversight of farming. Two, we must require that municipal zoning codes do not reinscribe exclusionary policies. Any municipal zoning of agriculture must include equitable access to the right to grow food, which includes appropriate livestock practices, and as an explicit and expressed purpose of those zoning codes. And three, policy needs to make a clear and actionable plan for supporting municipal capacity to actually do this regulation. So to enact reasonable, well-informed, equitable agriculture land use policies. The plan must include resources to support training for municipalities and robust community engagement. So with that, Ornella, I'd love to pass it over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jean. I'm going to speak very fast and do a really brief overview on the Land Access and Opportunity Board. We begin everywhere we go with our touchstones as an example of what are our values, and those are three. The first one is that we listen generously and that we speak our truth from our heart and mind. The second one is that we make the way that we work together an example of what is possible. And the third is that we trust that we each hold a piece of the puzzle and that we need each other's pieces to understand the whole picture. The LAOB was established as an act of law in 2022 as an independent state board to address disparities in land and home ownership for Vermont for people and groups who have been historically and systematically marginalized from land and home ownership. Who are these marginalized populations? They are all poor and low-income Vermonters. They are Vermonters with disabilities. They are LGBTQIA Vermonters. They are immigrant people new to Vermont, Vermonters who are people of color, and Vermonters who are psychiatric survivors. Our board is composed of 12 appointing authority. We can have up to 24 board members. Right now we have 19, and we have lots of participations from all of our appointing authorities, except one at this moment in time, the Pride Center. You know, they were going through some transitions. Because we center communities who have been most marginalized and disadvantaged in housing and land access systems, we recognize that the LAOB belongs to all Vermonters, and that the LAOB operates from a foundational belief that when those who are most marginalized do better, we all do better. Improving access to land, housing, and home ownership for marginalized populations improves access for all Vermonters. We do better when we listen to marginalized communities in our lawmaking, in our rulemaking, and our program development, and it makes for better informed programs. We see it over and over again. We are a nonpartisan body, and we're dedicated to fostering civic engagement and community-led system-wide solutions to personal and community poverty. Our statute is unique and potent. Our broad duties are two, and we see them as advisory powers and grant-making powers. As a part of what we call our advisory powers is how we land to this work. So we advise and work with State of Vermont and affiliated institutions to review, monitor, and develop policies, programs to promote racial, economic, social, and climate justice for Vermonters from historically marginalized and disadvantaged communities. So why is this issue important to the LAOB? Because our communities are unanimous. The ability to grow food is central to their sense of health and well-being, to housing security, and their connection to land in Vermont. Vermont is so special. It is special because of its thriving culture of agriculture. We are host to the best cheese in the world, the best honey in the world, and we have Highland cows that are the oldest line in the United States in our state. What is organic as a standard was first defined here in our state. And we couldn't have imagined a moment of time like this in so many different ways, and especially at a moment in which we could see our Vermont agriculture under threat. We cannot take for granted in this moment that Vermont has had a culture of agriculture. We need to make sure that we ensure that all of our communities have access to growing food. Consolidation of agriculture and food sectors has led to a steady and precipitous decline in the number of people who are able to center agriculture and growing food in their lives as their livelihood. And even as people value growing food for food security and for cultural practice and mental health, their ability to do so is threatened because of lack of access to land and resources, and because the generational knowledge is being lost because parents are having to sell their farms because we're not able to keep farms in our families in the ways that we were able to before. In Vermont, if Vermont is to allow municipal regulation over agriculture, we must do so carefully to ensure that all Vermonters have the right and ability to grow food, even if they live in downtowns and dense neighborhoods. Caution that municipal zoning and land use regulation has been used intentional and inadvertently to disadvantage marginalized communities from pursuing their economic and cultural well-being. Jean, can I pass it on to you?
Absolutely. Thank you, Ornella. I think that last point, Ornella, you made is really important, that land use regulation and municipal authority is, of course, an important tool, but we cannot move forward with this tool over agriculture without acknowledging both the ways that land use zoning has been intentionally weaponized and also inadvertently, accidentally create a tool of marginalization because of lack of capacity and lack of know-how of how to do it best. So in terms of moving forward, we're seeing this momentum developing around focusing municipal regulatory authority on downtown districts. And while we absolutely support the limited impact on our rural working lands, we do want to really underscore a lot of caution of just, oh, well, these are just downtown districts and there's not a lot of impact. If we move forward without caution and care, this focused authority on downtown areas will have an outsized and discriminatory impact on low-income Vermonters' right to grow food. As we know, the majority of our affordable housing, and with the intentions of Tier 1, more and more affordable housing will be consolidated into downtown areas. That's where the overlap happens of the outsized impact on low-income Vermonters. So we are recommending that, I appreciate and we appreciate that this is evolving and there's lots of conversations there about RAPs and what's the best approach. But as we move forward, whatever we do that allows for municipal authority to regulate agriculture, we really must make sure that there is affirmative policy, like Michelle said, that makes a clear and actionable plan to inventory and protect community food land. This is something that LAOB is advocating for every place we can. We noticed that agricultural and community food lands were not prioritized in Act 181. And we have worked with some of our RPC partners to advise this language, which is that Act 181 could be amended to intentionally incorporate community food lands into the future land use map categories that include downtown centers, village centers, planned growth areas, village areas, transition areas, enterprise areas, and hamlets. So communities know urban agriculture is an allowable and intended use in those areas. Regional plans could and should be required to show agricultural soil and also community food sources like community food hubs and food shelves on their community facilities maps. There is a land access and opportunity bill that is about to be introduced by lead co-sponsors Representative Chena and Karis Duncan that calls for a land security working group to actually provide an assessment and recommendations regarding the identification and protection of ag land for community food security purposes. As I said at the top, our further recommendations are we must ensure and require that any municipal zoning codes do not reinscribe exclusionary policies. And we need to make a clear and actionable plan for how we will actually resource and support municipalities in knowing how to regulate agriculture without creating exclusionary practices. We will submit our written testimony that has links to a couple of great resources on policy recommendations for urban agriculture. And one of them was even written by our own home Center for Agriculture and Food Systems at Vermont Law School. Both are excellent resources. And as your committee continues to pursue this issue, we really recommend referencing those. And we look forward to this ongoing discussion. We've enjoyed working with our fellow testifiers here today in coalition, and really appreciate you taking up this very, very important matter. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Jean. And Ornella, are you all set with your comments as well? Right.
We're happy to receive your questions if there are.
Yeah, so we're
any.
going to
Pass
ask
it on to you.
if you have questions. And we know that you may have to leave the meeting. but you're welcome to stay on and hear the rest of our conversation. And then, okay, I think I'll ask Jake if he wants to come up from Sustainable Jobs Fund.
Thank you. Just gonna get set up here real quick. All right. Okay. All right. Okay, so yeah, for the record, Jake Claro, the Farm to Plate Director at the Vermont Sustainable Jobs Fund. It is nice to be back here. So yeah, I'm going to give just a little bit of history of how Farm to Plate came to this issue, and also I think it has helped kind of how all of us have come to this issue in some respects, and how that's informed some of the proposed language that's been submitted to the committee. And I do want to just look at some comparisons between language that we've provided and that of the Agency of Agriculture, just to outline. I think there's really a lot of agreement, and there are some specific areas that we think we should focus on that still need some work, but that are certainly the gaps aren't too large to overcome. And I think also Representative Nelson, it might help clarify a question that you had as well around our position on the RAPs. So I came kind of across this issue first in a process to update what was a 1994 kind of planning guide, in essence, the Sustaining Agriculture Handbook for Local Action. So the Agency of Agriculture put this out in 94. From everything I understand, it was very popular, but kind of a limited print run. So it was hard to get your hands on it once you did, or once you didn't. And so we went through a process of updating this and modernizing it, essentially, to address new state regulatory issues, new local regulatory issues, and other ways in which communities could plan for and support agriculture in their communities. So there was 5 modules, and there was specifically one dedicated to local regulations. That was the 4th module. And what's interesting in looking at the 1994 document is, we're in a lot of ways still dealing with the uncertainties that folks back in 1994 felt like they were dealing with. So they indicated in this document in the regulatory section that there's a great deal of confusion and controversy over the extent to which a town plan or ordinance can regulate agriculture or agricultural practices. But they, stated that within the planning and development law, that no plan or bylaw adopted under this chapter shall restrict, at that time, the language accepted agriculture or silvicultural practices. And I think you've seen some of this language and the history from Mike O'Grady. Still kind of this idea that there are unfortunately, no records documenting the legislator's intent, but the common belief that it was there to protect farms from unreasonable local regulations that threaten the viability of agriculture. And at that time as well, the AAPs had yet to actually be formally adopted. So that was a year later in 95. So this guide was still acting under what were the accepted agricultural practices, which were voluntary and first proposed in 1987. So we're certainly dealing with something that has been in many ways an issue going back as far as 94 and perhaps even before. And just another thing that this document points out is that that there was actually a Lamoille Superior Court case that did determine that Section 4495 preempts any municipal zoning regulation which confines or keeps within limits accepted agricultural practices. And that decision was not appealed to the Supreme Court, but it was pretty total in its interpretation to say that this exemption is broad and not just pertaining to water quality related issues. So I'm not presenting this to like relitigate or propose anything around the Supreme Court decision, but rather to say like these decisions were being made and people were interpreting this as the norms and practices of the time. So generally from that point on, people accepted that these exemptions were fairly broad and meant that municipalities did not have the authority to regulate or limit accepted agricultural practices in a broad sense, not just for water quality. And I think this was reflected in our process when we were updating the document. There was really no discussion or deeper kind of analysis around the extent to which the exemptions existed for agricultural practices. And it was more, the focus was more on what was called agripreneurial activities at the time, which is now what we understand to be accessory on-farm businesses. So the gray areas that we were trying to address in the update was more to do with municipal regulations over those activities, because it was generally understood that agricultural practices there wasn't that uncertainty, and that it was pretty clear that the Agency of Agriculture had regulatory authority and that municipalities did not. And I think just another reason for that interpretation is that the AAPs, which then became the RAPs, have activities like on-site storage, preparation, and sale of agricultural products principally produced on the farm. That is not something that is speaking to water quality sort of regulation or activity. That is about sort of how a farm is managing storage, doing preparation, sale of products. So that was the kind of the paradigm, if you will, that we were operating under. And of course, why the Supreme Court decision when it came through was, I think a pretty big shock and surprise to people, because that felt like it was settled and that there was these other accessory on farm activities that may still need further clarification. So that's kind of then coming in to this process of how do we address this? What's the right language if still there are enough ambiguities in the way that the Title 24 exemption is written. How do we actually address this to make it clear? And I think also resolve, I think we are concerned, or we do want to work with municipalities and the League of Cities and Towns on resolving some of these tensions that may exist in communities. I think, as someone said earlier, farms don't want to be intentionally causing harm or impacting their neighbors. And so, we're equally in this and trying to find resolution. So this is, let me see, let's take that away. Just a table comparing the agency's language with the Farmer Coalition members have created. And what you'll see here is that there's actually a lot of identical language. So both the agency and the Farm Coalition have proposed that a bylaw under this chapter shall not regulate the cultivation or other use of land for growing plants, including for food, fiber, Christmas trees, maple sap, etc. Our one difference there is we're couching this under this notion of the right to grow food in order to be really comprehensive in covering what could be activities that fall outside of what's defined in the RAPs. And then Also in the coalition's proposal is that we extend that exemption to include the raising of livestock. And the agency is a little more narrow in this of defining it around raising, feeding, or managing small backyard poultry flock, including roosters. So there's some alignment here. And I think probably from my perspective, this is where a lot of the tension is coming from, is how do we construct the right language that allows for people to have livestock, but perhaps addresses instances where it might be happening in a place or in a way that has undue impacts on neighbors in high density areas. So that's two areas there. And then we both virtually identical here, and this I think gets to one of your questions, Representative Nelson, around including this language that farming that meets the minimum threshold criteria of the RAP rules, therefore and is therefore required to comply with the RAPs, is not protected by the right to grow food, would also be exempt. So the language is a little different, but in essence, the agency and the Farm Coalition are both proposing the same thing here, which is to very clearly exempt farms that fall under the RAP regulations to be exempt from municipal regulation. So in that sense, they're virtually identical. And then there are some smaller elements here. So both our proposal, the agency, are using the same definitions here to define farming. The agency has additional language around defining poultry, which we just don't think is necessary if you have a broad livestock exemption and you're not exclusively focused on backyard poultry, so you don't need to specifically define that. And then both have the construction of farm structures included in what is exempt. And this is all within the Title 24, Section 4413. So a lot of similarities here in actually what's being proposed. What has been mentioned is where the differences start to emerge is making changes to the actual RAPs. So our position is that those changes aren't necessary in order to both address some of these tensions with municipal regulation issues and also to provide clear exemption to farms in a broad and comprehensive way. So, the RAPs, in changing those, we're changing who is regulated for water quality purposes, knowing that that is not the only thing that they are concerned with or impact, but that changing them does impact potentially farms that do or do not fall under water quality regulations. And so, that may be an entirely different issue to discuss as to how should the RAPs be changed? Do they need to be changed and updated? It's just one that we don't feel actually is germane to addressing this issue at this time, and introduces a lot of additional complexity and change for farms, and may open up the RAPs in a way to additional input outside of this committee. So we have concerns about that. And so all of the proposed changes that the agency has suggested for the RAPs are ones that the coalition's position is do not change. So the income threshold, for instance, and I think this gets to as well with the income threshold is, could it be more than 2,000? Sure, but why is it 5? There isn't necessarily right now how is that being informed by data? Do we know sort of who that leaves out, who that now includes? And so again, just for the purpose of this process of addressing municipal exemptions, we want to avoid sort of digging into the RAPs and keep our focus and attention on the language of Title 24. And it just continues, and this is one that is an example of where the proposed changes we feel are just confusing, and is an example of sort of how in making these changes there may be unintended consequences or just uncertainty and clarity for farms as to how does this actually impact my operation. So I won't kind of go through the full language here, but it potentially, even the way that this was written in that section that's highlighted, is that less than 1 or between 1 and 4 would mean that a farm of exactly 1 would not actually be impacted by the language and how this is written. So there's things like that that we're just concerned about, and kind of the technicalities that, especially in light of the Supreme Court decision and how the legal system will interpret these things, that unless they are precise and absolutely correct, it just causes us concern. And in retaining kind of the language that's there, this would still allow for the agency to have jurisdiction over water quality regulation in cases where farms of less than 4 acres are in a municipality that does not have ordinances that are addressing water quality impacts. So it still kind of keeps the agency's regulatory authority intact over those kinds of issues.
Sorry, Jay, can you go back?
Yeah.
I'm just looking at it. It's a little hard to see on the screen there, but the Farmer Coalition finds the full implications of the agency's proposed changes to E into 2 parts difficult to interpret. So what we see here, E and F, that's currently, there's something that's E that is being.
Yeah, so the E here, which is what is
okay, gotcha.
currently in the RIPs, would be separated into E and F. And this language that's here, the Secretary has the discretion to determine whether the land base is adequate to properly manage, is part of, would be in our proposal in Chapter 24 around this right to raise livestock. So that right would be conditioned on the ability of the Secretary to make a determination as to whether that land base is adequate to manage those animals. And that starts, that starts to get towards this issue of, less than an acre, you've got far too many animals in a, a highly dense downtown area. The Secretary would have the discretion to say, that's too many for that location, and change would occur from that. So that's, we're taking a different tact here of integrating that language and that discretion into Chapter 24 rather than trying to make changes to the RIPs. And just another, the agency has proposed eliminating in the RIPs the Schedule F, the filing with the Internal Revenue Service. And again, just in not wanting to make these changes, but also, I don't think people are filing as farms sort of lightly. And so it seems like another thing as to, why exactly would we be eliminating this from the RIPs and potentially farms that then in turn would, be, if they didn't fulfill other criteria, but they did file a Schedule F, would be regulated by the agency under the RIPs. We want to kind of keep that as is.
Nelson.
Thank you. But if someone grows food for donation, they wouldn't necessarily file a 1040-F, would they?
Yeah.
And so I think by striking that language, it gives them protection to grow food for donation free of zoning, I think I think that's the intent of.
And so, and that's where I think where both the agency and we have proposed the right for, cultivation of land for growing plants, food, fiber, et cetera, as exempt from municipal regulation, that would cover someone,
There.
yeah, who's.
So you don't necessarily need the other language.
Exactly. Yeah. We feel like all bases are covered. That any farm that for whatever reason doesn't meet the $2,000 threshold, Schedule F, for contiguous acres, blah, 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 that these right to grow provisions cover activities beneath that from a municipal, yeah. Yeah.
Representative O'Brien.
Jake, do you know what jurisdiction municipalities have over farming, or I mean, this small scale farming as far as health officers go? Like, can I raise chickens in my basement or the attic? That, like, at what point can a health officer come in and say, the municipality doesn't think this is safe?
Right. I can't answer that with authority. I think given some of the conversations we were having with the league today is that, towns have ordinances or animal husbandry ordinances. There's certainly some of them already have that. They can institute those. And it potentially could address circumstances like that. Where there's, neglect or something like that that's occurring. So I don't think that's necessarily like theoretically or now outside the scope of what some municipalities can or already do. Yeah.
You had reached the last of
Yeah.
our slides.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, that's it. And I think there's a lot here that we absolutely agree on with both the agency and based on our conversations with the league. And I think, moving forward, it feels like the devil's in the details around some of these livestock questions and the question of where, and let's say if we were to agree that, the concern is 1A, how can that language be written in a way that still does not prohibit, the having livestock or raising food or whatever it may be. And there are no agreements around that yet. So this is what we have and kind of our starting point, and the framework that we're currently operating under.
So just thinking a little more about that, then what you've outlined here, I think is very helpful in this format to help us understand where your proposals and the agency's proposals line up or are different. But then in addition, there is the league's perspective, and you've been talking to them, and it sounds like, to be frank, you are closer to being in alignment with their position than you are with the agencies or theirs to the agencies. If I'm thinking about three different a triangle here. So I just want to maybe take another minute, if you have it, if you've got another minute, to understand where you might still be, dig in a little bit more to where you might still be not entirely lined up with the league and vice versa. And it sounds like, okay, 1A or something might be a designated area, but then within that, what rights do people have to grow their own food?
Yeah.
Is that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you've hit upon it pretty well in summarizing in that way. Again, we haven't seen formal language, so we're kind of speculating that we're close. But as we see specifics, it might reveal things that we had different assumptions about. And I think in total, between all sort of three major players here, like the Farm Coalition, the VLCT, and the agency, I don't think there's a lot of distance between our positions, and it becomes a matter of whatever term you want to use, like elegance, simplicity, clarity. And I think, with the agency, probably our difference here is that we think this approach is more clear, and involves less maybe unintended consequences in not opening up the RIPs. And then with the league, I think there's still a bit of an unknown of we haven't seen formal language, and so we need to kind of compare and contrast and see how they respond, because we have just shared our language with them as well. So, seeing how they respond to that. But based on conversations, I think there's a lot of agreement and alignment and willingness to work out kind of what the differences might be.
I think that we often do, but we don't always see all of our different types of farmers and farmer groups speaking with one voice collectively. So I want to note that. And I'm sure that the agency that everyone is working with best intent here to try and solve a problem. But I also want to point out that it's not as much of a problem today as it will be tomorrow, and as it will be the next day, and then the week after that.
Yeah.
We all, I feel like, have heard consistently from everybody who's testified, and maybe all feel ourselves that the court might not have gotten this right, but we don't have any say in that. And now we're in a new situation, and the status quo is not what it was before. And if we don't do something fairly soon, the new status quo will begin to be felt more strongly.
Yeah.
So all of which is to say, the sooner we address this, the better.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm glad you are saying that. And I think there's definitely an urgency on our part to compare and contrast the language and get to an agreement. And I think, as I was listening back on Michael O'Grady's testimony, just hearing that, like, the fact that it's difficult right now to even interpret what stands within the REPs and what you can and cannot say as to how they may or may not apply beyond water quality is, troubling. And that's the patchwork kind of scenario and uncertainty that we strongly want to avoid. And I think there's a lot of alignment and agreement amongst the parties on that.
Well, appreciate that, and again for putting this together.
Sure. Yeah, thank you.
I do have any other questions, and we can continue to talk about this. Sometimes it's helpful to have our witnesses here while we're talking in case we have questions. But Representative O'Brien.
Jake, so you're saying that the coalition would prefer the sort of right to grow your food. That's just a different conversation, different legislation. Whether it's up here, then fixing that at the same time as we fix this municipal regulation.
No, I think so. We're using that terminology to include in Title 24, which is the municipal exemptions. That's our chosen language, and what that means is that it would exempt, not only farms covered by the REPs, which is more clearly stated, but also just the act of cultivation of plants and the raising of livestock. So I think to really make the point that Vermonters have this right to do this without presuming in infringement or prohibition to do it. But yeah, the language we're proposing around this right to grow food is directly tied into the title that deals with municipal exemptions and this issue. Yeah.
Because it made me think of these sort of weird oddball instances where, when we're talking about the food for like raising food, there's certain invasives that are edible that are food that ANR already does not let us do. And they're Africanized honeybees that probably the Agency of Ag doesn't let us raise. So there's livestock that's already regulated. And I wonder if municipalities could sort of, if they wanted to, move in that direction too.
I don't know. I don't know. But what you're bringing up is regulations covered by state agencies, which is not. And and I think in some sense, we do want to prevent municipalities acting sort of again, like this patchwork manner that may apply in some places and not others. And also keeping those decisions with people who have really the technical expertise, the agricultural expertise to make that kind of determination as to whether or not something is like invasive or should be prohibited. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, municipal regulation would be patchwork just by definition, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Any other questions for anybody who spoke, and who's still here anyway? Thoughts?
I just wanted to speak, if that's all right, to the question of consistency across municipalities. And I think there could be a solution there of saying that they're required to, if they want to regulate, for example, the number of livestock, that they would be required to consult with the agency of ag. And the agency could be responsible for saying, look, this is what we consider a reasonable number of goats on a half acre. Like, you could have this many to this many. That's a reasonable number. So that then towns would have some guidance. And if they went outside of that agency guidance, then they might have to provide some sort of justification for it as a way of creating some consistency amongst those that if it were to be 1A municipalities, those municipalities regulating livestock within their 1A areas.
And I have to go to get my daughter, so.
Thank you, Jay.
Yeah, thank you.
Representative Nelson has a question.
Is the language we had Ledge Council draw, they've seen that, or is that out for public yet, or?
We have not had Ledge Council draw up any language. We had, the agency brought in some language, and, Ledge Council may have helped format that. I can't recall, but, we haven't given out any direction yet.
We were very short.
Oh, I'm sorry. I apologize. Yes, you're right. We did. We did ask Ledge Council, and that language was like how to get back to the status quo without
Yeah,
changing anything else.
without digging into rap.
I think
I
yeah.
kind of like that.
Yeah, I think everybody probably has seen that. And maybe we get asked have you seen that? And would you like to comment on that?
I
Come on up to the table. Yeah.
glanced at it,
Yeah.
but only over the shoulder of my Farm Bureau colleague. So I haven't read it carefully, and so I can't really comment to that. Which
So it did not address a right to grow food. It did not really do anything other than say, if we were living in a world where we had the ability to do so and wanted to just go back to the previous understanding, it would codify with a few words. It would clarify with a few words the intent of, that we thought was there all along, and made it a little clearer. So it didn't address that, right? It didn't exclude any 1As or anything. Yeah.
I don't want to speak for all of us because we haven't had that conversation. I certainly think there would be a lot of welcome for just returning things to the status quo. But I think that you would then find that maybe those of us who've been having these conversations around a right to grow food might come back to you and say, we would still like to codify this piece of it. Not to be speaking out of turn, but I think there's definitely become a lot of interest in that, looking at my colleagues around the room, because of that, wanting to protect that right of all Vermonters to have access to food, even if they aren't a farm, to be able to grow it. But other wouldn't object.
Representative O'Brien.
No, I mean, it's just becoming increasingly clear that, speaking of triangles, we've got, Taft Street decision here. We've got this right to grow food discussion, and then also 181. And so do we want to, have one solution there, or do we, break it down into
the more we try and tackle, the more complex it becomes.
Exactly, yeah.
I mean, in the same way that there may be some concern about opening the wraps, because that would, could evolve into a conversation that escapes our control. That could happen with statutory changes too, in other parts of, other titles.
Mhm.
Maybe just in this title.
Mhm.
Caroline.
For the record, Caroline from board with Rural Vermont. Really appreciate the testimony taken today. I just, as a member-led organization, I also want to mention that we have a person in our network reach out to us. I'm not sure if they are willing to speak in testimony, but I want to stress that the right to grow food also becomes important as people below the regulatory threshold of the RIPs. In the moment where they start farming, they might not be determined to be a farm yet. And in that moment, this member specifically years ago had in the town of Shelburne, the experience that they received a cease and desist order as they just started their farming business where they might have not officially been a farm yet. So, and this farm did involve also livestock. So just in lieu of the member testimony provided, just wanted to shed another light of the avoidance of creating legal gray zones if we were not to include a right to grow food also for livestock.
What kind of livestock?
The diversified farm, so all the types.
Just to follow up, Caroline, what was the cease and desist? Was it was in violation of municipal regulation?
From what I heard, I can't speak to them, but they started operating, and as they started operating, they received a cease and desist order to farm in their particular location. And they had then to educate the town of Shelburne about the farming exemption, and apparently since then have like on and off like conflictual situations with their town and them imposing their jurisdiction over their boundaries.
Shelburne needs to be boycotted of food. I didn't say that. More remarks on.
Yes,
Just how
Representative.
how large that operation was.
I think it was it's not, we're not talking about less than 1 acre. There's I don't know their exact acre. I think they had like 30 acres in one location and a larger farming parcel outside of the town center, something like that. I stressed to them that they should reach out to you and provide at least a written testimony, and I'm not sure if they did that or cannot, do more.
I'd love to reach out to the Sisters of Anarchy that are in Shelburne, in their Prairie Farm.
Ice cream.
Yeah, the ice cream farm.
I know that
We went
we've
there,
been presented with, we've already heard quite a bit of testimony from farmers, and I suspect that if we put out a call for more, we would get as much as we wanted.
Yeah.
With the importance of this issue. And so I want to sort of take that as read, that we're going to, if we invited every farmer to come in, I doubt we would have very many who said, I think that we should change the rules and allow towns to regulate us.
Yeah. You're right.
Anybody have any other thoughts at the moment? Yeah, go ahead, Greg.
I do want to continue the discussion on tier 1A.
Okay.
I mean, tier 1B, I think that, we need to make sure municipalities don't govern, the full scope of agricultural activity in tier 1B, but there's too much land area that would affect, but tier 1A, I'd be interested to have more conversation I think, who that would affect right now. I mean, obviously Burlington area, Rockland, it sounds like. And then what does that look like on the ground, in more detail. And going forward, obviously, over time, that might migrate to other downtowns and keep that in. Anyway, I think I need more
Yeah, I think
information on
that
that.
the the process is unfolding out there in the world. And we saw a map from Rutland County the other day, and I think that whatever stage that's in, and I'm not going to be able to say where it is in the process, but it is at a certain step in the process. There are also, I think, Chittenden County and another county that are likewise at that same step. So there are those maps that in a preliminary way are showing what could, in theory, be 1A. And somebody asked the other day, maybe it was you, Greg, do we know how much ag land is in that? So we heard it's like 2% of the state land could be in that category. But how much of that is actually ag land? I think that's an important question. And maybe, were you able to speak to that?
We employed a GIS specialist, and I have asked him to try and answer that question. So he's trying to get the various files that he needs. I don't know what they are. He calls them shape files. I've never used GIS in my life, but he's attempting to get all of those files and put that together to try to answer that question, both for the purposes of just, it would be good to know, but also because of concerns about if these areas become exempt from Act 250 and they have prime ag soils, that means that the current offset that you have to provide under Act 250 for developing a prime ag soil would also go away in these areas. And that's a concern that the conservation districts have, because we would like to see, maximum funding for conservation of ag lands. And so that loss, I also wanted to see if we could calculate that loss as well.
So getting that information has several purposes.
Yeah, there's a gentleman that works over the Agency of Agriculture, and I'm escaping his name, but very passionate about our prime ag soils, and he could give us those numbers up. Yeah, Ryan Pat. Yeah, very quick.
Yes.
Yeah, we've asked the agency to come in and talk about that, but to talk about soil, but not about this specific question. So let's reach out, see if they have that information.
Yeah, I just had a thought on a totally different tangent. Michelle, you said you were from St. Albans, is that right?
Yes.
You realize that we're waiting for somebody from St. Albans to come and fill Casey Troof's seat to sit in this seat to be on this committee? Seriously, we need somebody from St. Albans to step forward. So either you or talk to your friends. We need another committee member, so.
They're interviewing him this week.
Are they? Okay.
And you should have somebody from Franklin County.
Okay, well, we're waiting.
Thanks for allowing. Yeah.
Would there ever be a way of, the way I'm thinking of municipal health officers, have jurisdiction over certain things in the town, but I would assume they're almost consistently following state rules. And so if there was a way for municipality to regulate farming, but they would have to go through the Agency of Ag essentially as their guide.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure how many towns have a health officer. How many small towns? I'm thinking of mine.
You have to.
Turkey sure does.
Statutory.
Okay. Did not know that.
But I don't know if any municipalities have their own specific health rules that aren't state rules.
Yeah.
I think so, but maybe.
We've touched on some things that would create more work for the agency. So it would be interesting if any of them wanted to move forward and what they would have to say about that.
Yeah.
I'm guessing they wouldn't embrace having to coordinate with many towns on minutia.
At least there might be statewide consistency though of the jurisdiction.
Yes, but still it would
Enforcement, right?
a lot of work.
Yeah, I mean, when Steve Collier was here, I think I asked him about whether or not they were prepared for that level of workload, and sounds like they were willing to take it on,
Mhm.
at least with what they were suggesting for the jurisdiction they were looking at handling. So
Oh, I would just suggest that one of the things that we've been talking about is the need for clarity in whatever regulations get adopted both at the state level and by towns. If there's really good consistency and clarity, that might alleviate some of the burden on the agency, because if the agency leaves it really gray, then they get called every time. But if they can provide really clear guidance that says, this amount of land base is the minimum you need for this number of animals to be safe and healthy, then some of those calls go away.
One thing that I've been talking, I think Caroline and I talked about, I mentioned the idea of, you know, having a town-based, you know, sort of like, trying to think of what to compare it to offhand. You have a tree warden, right? We have a tree warden in Cabot. You have the livestock warden or the, the farm warden, in this case, for when you get below, you know, if the agency values at a point where like, this is just, we don't want to get all this down to this all nitpicky detail. Whether it's an individual or you have a group of folks that are elected within the town to do that, but make sure that was so they're actually part of the farming community and not.
Yeah, I was gonna say, it'd be all right if you had rural Vermont handling that, or NOFA handling that,
Right.
just because they're kind to agriculture, but you get the wrong person in charge of that. You think of that going wrong in so many ways.
Yeah,
And in the tier 1A aspect of it, they weren't so much, the Vermont leagues of cities and towns weren't so much against growing your own food. It was if you were gonna have like farm stand. Well, you couldn't have it right on the corner where you're impeding traffic. You'd have to have it as a way where someone could, you know, where the ingress and egress was gonna be. You know, your normal traffic pattern worries, you know, that's how they present it to us.
Which accessory on farm business?
Yeah,
Already, right?
Yeah, and you know, I can understand that. I guess, but you know, maybe other people in this room would say no, you know, but I don't, you know, we probably have to worry about what is reasonable on their end as well.
I think that, to the extent that there are different interests here, we tend to have, in this conversation is a good example, I think we're hearing mostly from one perspective, and we need to bear in mind that out there in the rest of the building and the rest of the world, there's another perspective that may be, you know, louder or will become louder.
Well, I mean, a lot of us represent municipalities too, to some extent, and
Yeah.
select boards.
Right,
Yeah.
yep.
It just seems to be that it's a little too simplistic to look at acreage equals, no, X acres means Y animals. And that's because there's so many factors that could be involved, like what else is in there? What's the grade? Is there a well? Runoff, where's the runoff gonna go? There's so many factors that I don't know that the agency could easily do what you were suggesting.
Good point.
That's why they want to raise, you know, the wraps in the farming, and then they can speak to that, because it'd be on lesser of a scale. You know, as opposed to somebody with 25 chickens. Not that 25 chickens aren't important.
if there was some sort of community-based volunteer.
Yeah.
Effort to help with that. I mean, how many of our. Yeah, I don't know, depends on how much you want to grow the size of the. Department bag for jurisdiction on farming, you know,
Yeah.
I could get. A lot of backyard. Operations.
So right now, we don't have any other, I don't think we have any other scheduled testimony on this issue, and that doesn't mean that we can't be continuing the conversations outside of the room with anybody and everybody, and that other people will be having those conversations without us. But I think it would be helpful to sort of say, be nice by the end of the week to be closer to solving this problem. Partly just because, again, I think there is some urgency to moving ahead. And we also have other things that we want to be taking up. And the longer any conversation drags out, the more likely we are to say, let's just finish this and not have our best, product there. So I think for those reasons, we can maybe think about, let's see what we can have by Friday. Either from an external source or that we come up with ourselves as a committee. But that would be good. And I'll leave Ledge Council and say that we may be needing them to help us draft something. Anybody have anything else? I wanted to say two things. I didn't know this until I came in this morning, and I'm not sure whether other people knew too, but the Appropriations Committee has done its work, and I think it's signed off and voted on the BAA, and there is money in there for Bridges to Health, the full funding that we requested, and there is money for Vermonters getting Vermonters, $400,000. So that was, again, that's that's for the rest of the year, above and beyond what was in the budget last year. So I'm sure that it helped to have our committee speaking to that.
And the Bridges to Health got there.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, the
$167,000.
right? Yeah, but I think it was that exact amount.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
So it'll be, I think I heard correctly that it was voted out of appropriations maybe yesterday. They may have met, yeah. And that would then be coming to the floor of the House at some point soon, Thursday. Of course, the Senate would still have to sign off on it, or it would be being part of the conference. But anyway, that's where we are with that.
And the Land Access Opportunity Board. There's $1 million in there, but what it was, I asked the question. It was there, we appropriated it last spring, and for some reason it got swept. So they just made sure it was swept back.
Back in, okay.
Yeah.
Good. All right, well, thanks, everybody. We are here tomorrow morning, 9:30. We've got several bills that we're gonna get intros and walkthroughs on tomorrow. And the Champlain Valley Farmer Coalition is coming in as well to just introduce themselves. We haven't had that. I don't know that they haven't asked, but they usually like to come in and just share their.
Be here in person.
Yes, well, I don't know if they'll be in person, but he is listed as the witness. And maybe there'll be others too. I wouldn't be surprised. And then the House floor doesn't kick off until 3:30 tomorrow. We're moving to 3:30 start, which does mean I know that we'll be ending the day a little bit later. But when we get to a point where the floor schedule is busier, we'll go back to an earlier start. All right. Thank you, everybody.